and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today are Paul Galloway, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer, and Ben Poole, Writer at CTMfile. Welcome back, Paul and Ben.
Thanks, Push. Good to be back.
Yeah, great to be here with you today, Push.
Remarkable, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your viewpoint with us on topics that impact the world of cash and treasury management. It's time to delve deeper and get your perspective on our topics for today, namely, IMF warns that global trade restrictions have almost tripled over the past 4 years. Open banking reaches a milestone in the UK. The Africa Climate Summit 2023 kicks off to address the impacts of climate change on the African continent. And finally, Elon Musk's X continues push to become a payments company. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting CTMfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Let's start today's discussion with our first story, wherein the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has cautioned that global trade restrictions have almost tripled over the past 4 years. According to Geeta Gopinath, IMF First Deputy Managing Director, almost 3,000 restrictions were imposed just last year, nearly 3 times the number imposed in 2019. Gopinath has explained that foreign direct investment is increasingly motivated by geopolitical considerations rather than geographic proximity, which she noted points to an increasingly fragmented world. Rising geopolitical tensions and the resulting fragmentation of the global economy could increase financial stability risks, lead to competing payment systems, reduce trade, and cross-border investments. Paul, do you think global economic fragmenting into geopolitical blocks is here to stay, with each bloc trying to pull as much of the rest of the world closer to its respective strategic interests? And if so, what kind of implications will this fragmentation have on multinational corporations' treasury departments?
Well, Push, I think, when it comes to fragmentation, I think there are certainly drivers that, whether it's geopolitical or otherwise, that cause this type of behavior to continue to happen. When I think of it from an economic standpoint, I think it lasts for only as long as the economic benefits are there in place. So do I think trade restrictions have economic impact? Yeah, they absolutely do. Do I think that countries or locations will play favoritism? Yeah, they absolutely will. So, I think it lasts for a period of time. Do I think it's here forever? No, I don't think that's the case. I think we're already seeing evidence out there that fragmentation is breaking down in some areas for where it had been in place for a long time. We've seen evidence of nearshoring, onshoring happening. So, there's been a change in distribution patterns, and we look at what's going on at the G20 right now and India hosting that. And, I think India is really poised to perhaps displace some of the activity that happens in China today, potentially. I don't think fragmentation in general will go away, but I think the shape of that will change over time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul, in terms of how the market's evolving. Obviously, trade restrictions, they push up the cost of doing business and in extreme cases can even sort of prevent business from getting done. That sort of protectionism undermining open markets. I think one response to all of this that offers a bit of a silver lining, maybe a bit of a glimmer from hope, comes from technology, which is being used to foster the growth of e-commerce and digital trade. So sort of developing infrastructure and skills and, importantly, the legal frameworks and standards for digital trade. In the UK, we've got the Electronic Trade Documents Act coming into force in a couple of weeks, which is an example of that. This act will enable companies to remove all of the paper and inefficiency that exists in the trade space today and ensure that future trade is cheaper, faster and simpler. So I think that's kind of one area where, we've got this sort of negative news from the trade restrictions, but there is a lot of work on the digital side of trade that is perhaps helping to counterbalance that a bit in a way that previous times of protectionism hasn't been possible. So I think that's more positive.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And you think about it from a treasurer's perspective, obviously, if you're with an organization where trade finance is, a key aspect of what you do, the use of technology is going to have an impact on how you manage that. It also offers opportunities for greater efficiencies. So I think from a treasurer's perspective, they have to keep, especially for an organization that would be global in nature, keeping on top of what's going on out there. It's a day to day, a week to week, month to month type of activity. You have to be strategic in how you approach things because they do change over time. And if you aren't staying on top of it as a treasurer, you could be left behind in a position where you have lack of access to adequate liquidity to manage your trade finance platform.
That's a great point. From global trade restrictions and fragmentation, let's shift the discussion to open banking that has reached a milestone in the United Kingdom, surpassing 11.4 million payments in July 2023. This reflects a 9.3% increase in total payments compared with the previous month, highlighting the growing adoption of open banking services. Ben, you covered this story for CTMfile, and according to you, if I may, how will businesses in the UK benefit from the significant growth in open banking?
Thanks, Push. Yeah, it is growing slowly but surely. But I think what's driving this is the variety of use cases that corporates have from open banking. I think one of the biggest selling points of open banking is the ability to access multiple bank accounts with one platform, often just using an API to pull in the data from all these multiple sources. So a treasurer of a large business that might have multiple entities could see huge time savings and efficiency gains in terms of pulling together all of that transaction and balanced data. So open banking could allow a treasurer to collate their dollar, euro, sterling and yen positions all in one place, for example. So that's just one example of how it can be used to benefit the treasurer's life. I think KYC is quite an interesting one. Open banking presents an opportunity to do sort of fast background checks and create like a passport API that treasurers can send all the information from their bank. And I think also like payments you mentioned there, faster credit decisions is another space. So the amount of use cases that really help to simplify what the treasurer is doing and speed up in certain cases the data and their access to that. I think that kind of speaks for itself, and more companies are sort of finding the efficiencies that they can unlock by tapping into some of these open banking use cases that are applicable to their business.
Yeah, this was definitely a relevant article here when I think about non-bank financials and what companies are doing today to provide bank-like services within their companies. Puts a new layer of activity that a treasurer has to be on top of. So you can have the ability to offer financing, the ability to offer payment mechanisms as a company that sells just about anything. So, the landscape's completely changing when you think about open banking. It's another layer of the progress that we're making in terms of you don't have to go to a bank to actually bank anymore. Companies are becoming banks within themselves, and the ability to do that is becoming more and more common. I think this is just an example of the acceptance by people out there, the consumers. The consumers want this kind of thing. They like the convenience. It makes it easy for them especially if it's an organization, a company that they hold in high regards and have a lot of value. They'll trust them and they'll use the product or service that they're offering. So, this is just going to continue to grow, I think, on a global basis.
Yeah, embedded finance is a really interesting trend, I think, when you start digging into it. And I know that the banks are sort of finding ways that they can support the corporate, then sort of resell, if you like, the banking services as part of the customer journey that corporates kind of engaged with. And treasurers are having to think about a lot more perhaps today with the growth of things like e-commerce than they ever had to before. So it's a whole new area, and it's one that's really, really interesting to get stuck into.
Sure is.
Absolutely. Those are interesting comments. Paul, your comment on banks becoming companies themselves. And Ben, you mentioned the nuances of open banking in terms of the benefits that could accrue to corporations in the UK, as well as embedded finance. I think those are great insights, and I hope our audience was paying particular attention to what both of you said when it came to open banking. Our next story to feature in today's discussion revolves around the Africa Climate Summit 2023 that opened this week in Kenya to address the impacts of climate change on the African continent. The first ever Africa Climate Change Summit has brought heads of state, diplomats, and experts from all over the continent for 3 days in Nairobi, Kenya, to discuss important topics like climate finance, renewable energy, land use, and sustainable infrastructure. The United Nations has estimated that the loss and damage in Africa due to climate change will be between $290 billion and $440 billion in the period from 2020 to 2030, depending on the degree of warming. US government's climate envoy to the summit, John Kerry, has said that of 20 countries most affected by the climate crisis, 17 are here in Africa. Paul, when you hear John Kerry's comments on the African climate crisis and the United Nations estimates about the loss and damage in Africa due to climate change, do you think of all the risks that corporate treasurers and CFOs face in an uncertain business environment, climate-related and environmental risks should top their risk agenda or certainly be one of the most important things to keep in mind?
Yeah, Push, this certainly seems like something that needs to be kept in mind for sure. I worked for an egg company here in Iowa, global company. We did a lot of work in Africa to help them with crop production, working on creating genetic crops that could survive in inclement weather, typically in Africa, dry weather, where there's not a lot of moisture. It's a problem to begin with in Africa. They have a lot of desert area. They have a lot of area where it's not ground for producing crops and so forth. There's a lot of people in Africa, so when you think about the issues of climate change, they're right in terms of the countries that are producing some of the greenhouse gas effect. Companies that are manufacturing and creating this, create this on a global basis, the issue. And so it's one of those things where, they didn't necessarily ask for any of this to happen. Perhaps they've purchased goods and services from organizations that are tied to the impacts of the global warming. At the same time, it's, they still didn't do anything in their proximity to create the problem. And so now you're exacerbating something that is a problem to begin with before even any of this was an issue. So, obviously they can't ignore it. It's got to be something that's top of mind for them. So the bigger challenge, I think, from, a climate change perspective is how do you get everyone globally on the same page to do the same thing? That is really difficult to do. I'm not sure how we do that. If we as people, human beings, can't come together and find a solution, Mother Nature will find the solution for us. So that's just the way it works.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think from a treasury perspective, we're quite familiar with a variety of instruments that green bonds, green accounts, different ways that corporates can find certain financial benefits for themselves for operating in a sustainable manner. And the move to operate in that way might not come directly from Treasury. It might be from the company's senior management in most cases. But there are a variety of ways that Treasury can help support such a move. One issue when I was thinking about this topic that corporates are having to deal with, particularly in the US, is that anti-ESG lobby, which is quite a political lobby targeting financial institutions, voluntary climate organizations, federal agencies and corporates to try and push back against the legal side of ESG a little bit. Corporates are primarily targeted through public contracts, I think. I was reading, for example, in Alabama, corporates that discriminate based on ESG factors can no longer do business with the state. And energy companies are also targeted. In Texas, public investments are restricted from companies that discriminate against the fossil fuel industry. So that's an interesting wrinkle, I think, in the whole topic, is that there is a burgeoning movement to sort of push back against it, quite a political movement. So it's just another headache for corporates to factor in when planning how to best approach this topic.
Yeah, Ben, that's been, I think, a challenge for many organizations. I know that I had lots of questions from my banking partners when I was a practitioner. What is your position on ESG? Are you making investments as an organization? And there's plenty of companies out there taking a position, and there's plenty of companies that aren't. I think some of the challenges from an investment standpoint are, when you're making investments in that kind of arena, one, you got to have the appropriate risk return profile. You have to look at that. You can't ignore it as a portfolio manager. But the other thing is that to qualify as true ESG, what does that mean? The definition, it feels like in some instances is being loosely interpreted. And so you may be investing in something that's potentially papered as ESG, but in reality, it doesn't meet all the right qualifications to be there. So it's, selecting the right investment, I think, is a challenge to support that effort.
Yeah, trying to stay away from greenwashing instruments that are out there. Treasurers have really got to kind of get under the hood if they're investing in a short-term investment vehicle that purports to be ESG. What does that actually mean? You've got to kind of get the due diligence rigorously applied in those circumstances.
Yeah.
What a riveting analysis when it came to this topic about environment-related risks and climate crisis. Both of you seem to know so much about it. That's really interesting. And moving on from climate crisis, our next topic is about payments. So this story is about Elon Musk's X continuing its push to become a payments company. X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, is reported to have obtained money transmitter licenses from 7 US states over the past month. After his US $43 billion takeover of Twitter in April, Elon Musk has outlined his ambitions to transform the platform into a financial super app along the lines of Chinese social media app WeChat. In a gathering on Spaces, Musk mused on an idea to emulate his first business, PayPal, creating the infrastructure for Twitter to process payments complete with connected debit cards and bank accounts. Ben, Elon Musk cut his teeth in the payments business with PayPal and now harbors ambitions to move into payments via X. If that happens, it will be Musk's second act in financial services. Given that payments is taking center stage within corporate treasury, how do you think will Musk's potential foray into payments impact the payments landscape?
Thanks, Push. Yeah, I think this is a move that's been long expected to try and turn Twitter into something like Alipay or WeChat, as you said.
Right.
I think basically you've got to look at it as the potential for the launch of a new mobile payment channel. So it's another issue for treasurers perhaps looking at, okay, if this is a new payment channel, are we going to accept it? How do we accept it? What's the relationship like between us, the app, and the customer? How is that integrated into what we're already dealing with? I think we've spoken before about the huge array of payment channels that are now out there, and companies have to decide, not every company can use every single different payment channel, but how do you set up the most optimum, efficient way to allow your customers to transact with you in a way that isn't full of friction and frustrating them? They just want to be able to, they don't care about the payment, they want what they're buying. So how can you smooth that as easily as possible? So yeah, just thinking about it as a new mobile payment channel and kind of figuring out how it fits in. So I think we're still a little way away from the launch of anything like that, but clearly these licenses that he's been hoovering up in the US definitely point in that direction.
Yeah, when I think about many respects, it used to be a lot easier when everything was transacted with paper and coin currency. You knew what you had, it was in your pocket, and then checks became a thing, and then debit cards became a thing, credit cards, and now you can pay with your phone or your watch, or you got all these different options now to pay. You can still pay with cash if you want, or a check, or debit card or credit card. And now your phone or your watch can do the same thing too. So it's changed the landscape of how payments are being made. And, if I'm Elon Musk, this kind of makes sense going this direction. I'm still a little bit taken back by changing the name from Twitter to X. It might take me a while to not call it Twitter, but
I find that crazy. It's a bold marketing decision, but it's
the name change. That one's hard for me. But this concept of transforming X into a payment platform, you already have a captive audience. The question will will the captive audience buy into X as a payment platform for them? That remains to be seen. So I wouldn't put it past Musk being successful. He's had success in the past. So we could see this very well being something that people utilize. Who knows, other social media platforms may model themselves after this. Who knows? It's hard to say, but this is definitely something that is in his wheelhouse. And if anyone can make it work, it seems like Elon's probably the guy that will make it work.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about whether it would be available to all users, or, if you have to be on the premium subscription to, unlock all of the functionality of this. So that's something that we can kind of sit back and look as it develops. Like you say, he's got the financial savvy to figure out a way to make it work and make money along the way.
Absolutely. And I think if he set his eyes on payments, and given the fact that he has payments experience with PayPal, to your point, Paul and Ben, I think this is second act definitely is something that is going to happen at some point in time, given that WhatsApp has already got into payments, Meta's WhatsApp, as well as Apple and Goldman's partnership may not be looking too good at this stage, but has done quite a lot within the financial services landscape, particularly in terms of raking up deposits. So plenty to watch when it comes to this space. Finally, gentlemen, what is your choice for the biggest or most important story of the past week, and why? Paul, can I ask you to do the honors first, please?
Yeah, certainly a lot of things going on out there. Trump indictment, Moderna's COVID shots seem to be working on the new strain, but COVID cases are coming back. G20 summit's happening, India's taking a spotlight. But the most recent economic data here in the US is showing that economic growth is looking to remain strong. The US dollar has strengthened. And so I think from an economic standpoint, what we're seeing going on in the US is not what I thought we were going to see 6-9 months ago. So this has just been really interesting to see this unfold. So to me, looking at the landscape and kind of the growth forecast from the Fed, it's looking like it's going to be rather frothy for some time. So the question will be, is it rate pause? Is it pause, then raise again? I don't think we're going to see rate cuts for some time, perhaps sometime later in 2024, if things really settle down, slow down. But yeah, I think it's getting pushed out.
Yeah, here in the UK, everyone's sweltering in a heat wave this week. We had an absolutely appalling summer of rain every day, pretty much all the way through summer. And as soon as the kids go back to school and everyone's had their vacations, now the sun's out. So I suppose I should say that the climate topic is my main story for this week. But I'd probably also note that global trade restriction story. I think it's really interesting just to capture that data around just how much restrictions are being monitored around the world and the knock-on effect that this has for businesses globally. So as Paul said earlier, I mean, hopefully this is just a phase and we can get out of that phase hopefully quicker and sooner rather than later.
Those are great choices for the final story. Thank you ever so much, Paul and Ben, for your valuable and insightful comments. We would also like to thank our CTMfile audience for joining us on this edition of the Open Treasury podcast. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a great week. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.